This story is told from a woman's perspective. I work in the city and live out in the suburbs. To avoid traffic, I take the commuter train to and from work. It's economical, it saves time, and it's generally a pretty stress-free way of traveling. I say generally because once I had a very awful experience riding home from work. And to set the scene a little bit, this happened in the winter, so the sun was already down when I got off work at 5 p.m. In addition, it was snowing as well. I made it to the train station, only to find it was extremely crowded. I had to push my way onto the train and try to find a good seat. The cars were pretty filled up to the brim already, so I ended up sitting in the only open spot in the entire car. It was a bench seat, situated right next to this pretty big guy. When you ride trains, you get used to having to sit next to people, but even so, you can sometimes sit next to somebody who makes you feel really uncomfortable right away. This is what happened in this case. The man I was sitting next to was pretty damn huge, and he made me feel very uneasy. Even though the trains were crowded, the bench seats were still big enough to allow space between the two passengers sitting on them. This guy, though, kept on trying to press up against me. I kept my earbuds in order to keep him from trying to talk to me, but he was obviously not keeping to his side of the seat. As much as I tried to just ignore him, he made the entire ride extremely nerve-wracking for me. Several times even, I just wanted to get up and walk away, but the train was too crowded to even move. There were passengers standing in the aisle, and there wasn't any room at all. I did try to consider that perhaps he might not have been trying to do this on purpose. Maybe he didn't notice it happening. After all, he didn't have a lot of room either. The stop where I was supposed to get off at would soon arrive. I realized I'd have to get up then in order to make it out. As soon as we stopped, I hopped up and tried to force myself through the crowd of people. I made my way out to the doors as everyone began to leave, and I got off myself as well. With a bit of shock, I noticed that the man had also gotten off out of the doors from the next car down. There were a lot of people getting off at that particular stop, but then I noticed him staring directly at me. As he kept looking, he lit up a cigarette and just stood by the train station, watching me as I walked away. Most of the other passengers got into their cars and drove off. I was stuck walking the rest of the way home, though. I kept looking back over my shoulder, and for the longest time, he just stood there smoking his cigarette and watching me. Soon, the crowd dispersed, however. As soon as they did, he crushed out his cigarette and began to walk in my direction. He was moving very fast now. I sped up myself, now really worried. I checked back over my shoulder and was scared to see the man was now sprinting after me. I had no idea what he intended, but I knew this could be no good. The next part is pretty blurry. He must have caught up with me at some point, because I remember him tackling me. I recall getting hit and falling down to the sidewalk. I hit my head on the side of the curb and completely blacked out. Next thing I knew, I woke up in the hospital with a concussion and quite a few lacerations. They said the guy had a knife on him, and he'd cut open my shirt pretty badly. He had run off, though, when a couple of senior citizens who were out taking a walk saw him in the middle of attacking me. They called the ambulance for me. The police never found the guy in the end either. We had no idea what he really intended, but I guess I could have guessed. Since the man was never caught, I was scared to death for the longest time. Whenever I went to work, whenever I walked down the street, whenever I rode the train, I was terrified of the smallest things. It took me a long time to be able to recover from that experience. Sometimes you have to be really careful how you interact with some people. I had a very messed up experience several years ago when I was on a long nature hike. I was just trying to get away from it all for a bit. I do that about once a year. It's mostly on a hiking trail that doesn't go very deep into the woods. I've never really been the type to want to get totally lost in the wilderness anyway, though. On this particular trip, on the second day of hiking, I set up my tent in an area I thought was ideal. It actually looked like it had been camped in before. That's actually the whole reason I chose it. I set up a fire and tried to relax a little bit after a long day of hiking. While I was in my tent though, I suddenly saw a shadow of a very large man fall upon it. The man started slapping at the door of the tent, demanding I come out immediately. Confused, I went ahead and did so. There was an enormous, scary-looking man. He had a huge, scraggly beard and scars all over his forehead. I was definitely caught by surprise. The man started screaming at me for stealing his camping area. I was extremely surprised now. I told him I was sorry. It didn't really seem to me like anybody had been camping there recently. There wasn't a tent or even a trace of anyone there, other than signs of camping from a while ago. He didn't seem to care though. He just went on and on. I was about to offer to pack up my stuff and find another spot. However, in the middle of yelling at me, this very strange man just wandered off into the woods still yelling. Obviously, I didn't sleep too well that night. I kept expecting the guy to come back, but he never appeared before me again. The following day, I went further on with my hike. I had mostly forgotten about the encounter by the time I came to this ravine. I had been to this area before. You had to cross a long rope bridge to get to the other side. I always hated that. The drop was extremely steep, and right into the river as well. I was always scared the bridge would suddenly collapse while I was on it. I mean, it didn't look rickety or anything, and it always held tight every time I crossed it before, but it still wasn't an easy thing to get over, especially because I've always had a problem with heights. Anyway, I began walking slowly and carefully across the bridge. I was probably a fourth of the way across when I suddenly felt it begin swaying strongly. It was so sudden I almost lost my balance and tumbled below, but I grabbed and held on. I wasn't sure why this was happening, but then I looked behind me. The huge man from the night before was right behind me. He wasn't walking after me though. He was standing on the bridge right on the edge and using all of his strength to make it sway. Surely he was hoping I would lose my balance and fall in. I guess he figured that if I lost my balance and I got hurt, having me fall off the bridge would make it seem like an accident. Feeling sick and scared, I realized I had to do my best to hold on and slowly make my way across the bridge. I was extremely frightened and the bridge was swaying heavily. I got down to my hands and knees and crawled the rest of the way across. I had to keep looking back to see if the man was following me. He never did though. He just continued to make the bridge sway back and forth and even tried to turn it upside down in an effort to get me to fall over. I had to stop about 3/4 of the way across to throw up. I almost lost my grip because of the retching, but I managed to hang on still. It was a nightmare, and I didn't think I was going to make it. My hands were slippery and losing grip. It wasn't until my feet were safely on the other side that I finally calmed down a bit. When I was able to get up, I looked back across the bridge. The huge man was already gone. When I didn't fall, I guess he went back into the woods. I just waited on that side of the bridge till more hikers came across. I explained to them what happened, and they escorted me back across the bridge. I reported the guy to the park rangers, but I have no idea what happened afterward, if anything did at all. The strangest thing that ever happened to me happened on Thanksgiving when I was about 10 years old. My dad was working that night, so my mom and me were the only ones home for dinner. We lived in a slightly rural area. What I mean is that we weren't way out in the country, but the houses in the neighborhood were not side by side either. Ever since I've grown up, we've started having Thanksgiving dinner earlier in the day. When I was younger, my parents didn't do it that way though. In fact, I was a bit surprised when I found out it was normal to have it earlier in the day. We always had our dinner in the evening, no different than we would for any other meal. This year was the first that we were going to be having it without my dad home. He had been promoted recently, and part of that promotion had him working on holidays. That part was truly terrible, but he did make a lot more money, so we had things a lot nicer the rest of the time. My mom and I were just sitting down for dinner when we heard a sudden knock at the door. My mom got up and went to answer it. When she came back, I asked her who was there. She said at the time it was not important. However, later in life she explained to me that it was a drifter who was begging for food. She had offered to give him something, but apparently he had wanted to come inside and eat with us. She refused, of course. She offered to bring him some food to the door even. When he wouldn't accept that, she told him to just leave right now. The two of us sat down at the table, and we'd barely begun eating when we heard a loud shattering noise. The man had thrown a large rock through our living room window. My mom got up and immediately went to phone the police. I went with her, holding onto her leg as fear gripped me. I saw the drifter through the window. He hadn't smashed the hole big enough for him to fit through, though he was reaching inside with one hand and trying to break more glass off with the other. He began moaning, "I just want some turkey. Bring me some turkey." It was so weird and terrifying. He succeeded in breaking off more of the glass, which caused his hand to begin bleeding profusely. My mom grabbed me and shoved me into her bedroom. She sat me down on the bed, then went to the closet and pulled out my dad's rifle. I was scared to death already, but being a 10-year-old kid, I was also scared of the idea my mom was about to shoot a guy. Yeah, I know he was trying to break into our house, but it was still frightening. My mom left me in the room and locked the door behind her. I heard her yelling at the guy, but I couldn't make out either the words or his response. I just buried my head deep under the blankets. After a few more heated exchanges, I heard a gunshot that scared the hell out of me. I tried to be quiet for a few moments. Afterwards, I heard another gunshot. My mom came back to the room and locked the door behind her when she was inside. We then waited for the police to come. They got there pretty quickly, surprisingly. It took a while before I knew what truly happened. My mom hadn't shot at the guy. She'd fired off a warning shot. When the guy doubted she would use the gun on him and the warning shot hadn't scared him off, she fired another shot right next to his head. He quickly fled. The police picked him up pretty quickly after. It's quite weird, huh? Thanksgiving is not supposed to be the scary holiday. I'm a 17-year-old from the UK, and this took place a few months ago at my grandfather's funeral, or at least the after party for it. Me, my cousin, and her best friend were all drinking a bit, because that's what you do at a wake or whatever. I was 16 at the time it happened, and I needed to get home at 1 in the morning. I was completely shit-faced, so I called a taxi for myself. I wasn't going to be able to walk home in the state I was in. After 10 minutes, the taxi arrived. I quickly finished my drink, said goodbye to everyone there, and got in the taxi waiting outside. The taxi driver was a pretty ordinary-looking Pakistani or Indian-seeming guy, with dark hair and some thick glasses. I paid to go home, which cost something along the lines of £40, 50 maybe. I never said a word to him beside my destination. On the way, he asked a bunch of questions. My age, why I was out drinking so late, and why I was going home alone. I told him I was 18. I don't know why I did. Maybe I just wanted to feel older or not get in trouble or something. I said I was on the way back from a funeral and wanted to dull the pain. I didn't answer the last question he asked me though, if anyone was at home to open the door for me or see me to bed safely. At the time, I was just thinking the man was a good Samaritan, wanting to make sure I was safe. I just said that everyone at home was likely asleep, but it didn't really matter. I was often a rebel and came in late anyway, and they all knew that. In retrospect, I probably should have just said there was someone at home waiting for me to return. About halfway through the journey, the driver drove right past the turn he was meant to take. I pointed this out to him, and he just said his way was much quicker, and he didn't want to waste my time getting home. Wrong turn after wrong turn passed, and he used the same excuse every time. This way is much quicker, come on, don't worry about it. Then though, he turned down an alley near a closed-down theater and a car dealership, which was also closed down. I told him he must be confused, because this was nowhere near my house. The car slowly came to a stop, and I became even more confused. I asked him what was wrong. He wrapped his arm around me and told me he couldn't focus on the road because of how distracting I was. He leaned in to a kiss, but I blocked him with my hand and asked him what the hell he was doing. Keeping one hand on my shoulder, he grabbed my leg. This is when I started getting serious creeper vibes. He then unzipped his trousers and presented himself to me. I went from thinking he was just a regular guy who'd been receiving mixed signals or something to a full-blown rapist in seconds. He began to try and feel me up. I honestly had no idea what to do in this situation. Should I do what he wanted or try to escape? What if I didn't? He might try to kill me or something. I made a snap judgment and went along with it. I pretended everything was totally fine. I started to feel him up too. Luckily, before it could get anywhere else, he got a call. He told me he needed to answer it, and we had to do this some other time. I said okay, and he dropped me off at home. I haven't told anyone, and don't plan on doing so. I haven't called a single taxi since. I'm glad it didn't go anywhere further though, because if it did, I could have been killed or worse. Whoever was on the other side of that phone call, I really owed them my life. I called the police anonymously the next morning and gave them a description of the incident. No arrest has been made yet though. So I recently had the unfortunate ability to recall something really scary my older sister and I saw on a walk home during elementary school. She confirmed what I remembered was true, and the more I think about it, the more it scares my now 36-year-old brain. My sister Bianca and I are 4 years apart. I had the blessing of being able to have the most attentive and protective big sister ever, and she always had this remarkable sixth sense about her. So I was 7 years old, first or second grade. My sister was in the 5th grade, age 11. We lived in a small town in the South Bay area of California, about 45 minutes south of San Jose. It was an extremely hot day, but we walked the usual 8 blocks from our elementary school to our home. Some info regarding our mother. She worked nights stalking at our local Safeway most of my adolescent life, so we were very independent children. Get up, get ready for school, go on our own. Mom slept until 3:30 p.m., then cleaned up, washed, and made dinner. Then she went out to work right away. That's just some background for the type of childhood I had at the time. Every day, we stayed after school for an hour with our favorite kindergarten teacher, Miss Marfia. My siblings and I all had the blessing of having the same teacher that we developed a super close relationship with. We enjoyed helping her clean up and prepare for her morning class every day. Usually afterwards, Miss Marfia would drive us home, but she couldn't that afternoon. She had to stay later than usual to wait for her husband James to pick her up and take her to the mechanic to grab her car. This meant that my sister and I were going to be the only kids walking home at this time. We didn't care though because we loved helping out our wonderful teacher, who was also our friend. In the 90s, the area behind our house was undeveloped. A lot a good 3 blocks long by 1.5 blocks wide, directly in front of the newly placed skate park. From our backyard gate, we could see that very same park. Upon passing by that park, we would always race and run from the sidewalk that bordered it to the back door of our fence. This was my favorite, because my sister always let me feel like I was a winner. Halfway through the run this time though, I was ahead, as usual, and I was passing through the normal sticker brushes. There was a lot of dirt and ugly tall weeds that would poke you badly if you got too close. Some of the bushes you could even hide under, they were so big. I'm literally only 100 yards from the fence when I hear my sister suddenly scream out my name. Not like a normal scream either. She shouted my first and middle name extremely sharply. I stopped dead in my tracks. I turned around and yelled backward, "What?" Before I could even fully turn around to see what was going on though, she pummeled into me. She was grabbing my shoulders while wrapping her arm to shield my face from what I'm sure I would be scared of in that moment. This was all while pushing me forward. I was so confused. There was no time to say anything. From the break between her fingers though, I swore I could see 2 sets of legs under a large bush. This is where my memory plays like I'm just watching a movie, and I can rewind every detail. I've spent many hours with my sister, recalling everything I'd blocked out. I was scared, but I could vividly recall it still. I witnessed an assault. They were lying down under a larger bush, with both sets of legs exposed. I saw a man dressed in a red tank top, with blue dirty jeans and black boots. He had sunglasses on, and he was very agitated looking. This was because he was choking a young woman. She was probably barely 20, wearing overalls, a white shirt, and white sandals. Her face was dirty, bruised, and her lips were blue, scratching at his hands and screaming. This is all I got to see, obviously more than enough for a child. My sister quickly grabbed me and yanked me an alternative way. I was so scared, asking her, "What was that? That guy was killing her." My sister simply said we had to hurry home and tell my mom. All I could see after is a blur until we got home and woke my mom up, hysterically telling her what we saw. She called the police, but we never got any information regarding the woman. I've scoured the internet for anything about an assault, kidnapping, anything in the area, but I've never seen or heard anything. My sister cried when I asked her recently about this memory, thinking it was something I'd just had a nightmare about once. The details I recalled, though, made her scared that it severely traumatized me enough to not remember. Who knows, though? It's scary in any context. I really hope that that girl managed to get away, though, and the man that was attacking her reaped what he sowed eventually. I like to take an annual camping trip all by myself. I live in New York, but I was actually raised out in the country. Every year I have to get away from the hustle and bustle of city life and just enjoy nature for a bit. About 5 years ago, though, I had a really scary occurrence while out on my annual trip. I was out for a good hike, maybe about 2 days in, when I came across something that really surprised me. What was such a surprise to me was that there was actually an old cabin just out in the middle of nowhere in the mountains. Immediately, every horror movie about a cabin in the woods shot through my head. You know how you watch a horror movie and you see someone do something really stupid and you yell at the person and wonder how they could be such an idiot, then tell yourself that in that similar situation, you would never do anything stupid. Well, it seems that's much easier said than done. I did the stupidest thing. I went in to explore the cabin. It was old and rotted, and the floor made unbelievably loud creaking noises as I walked across it. It was a bit of a rush, actually. I kept expecting someone to jump out at me and scare the crap out of me. It was pretty obvious, though, that no one had been here in a very, very long time. There were some really neat things in the cabin, though, and nothing was really scary in there. There was some very unique rustic furniture that had almost completely rotted away. Mostly, it was like getting a view of a time long past. There were a few doors inside, and I opened them to see what the other rooms were like. There was a very rustic kitchen area, a very rustic bathroom. The third door I figured had to be a bedroom. I thought I should check it out. I opened the door, and indeed it was a bedroom. My heart practically stopped, though. I saw there in the bed, with the metal frame and rotted comforter on it, was a human skeleton. It was tied, about 8 straps if I remember correctly. What got me the most was that it didn't look like they were wounded. I crept up on it, looking around. I didn't see anything that could indicate why this person had died. I thought possibly someone had tied this unfortunate person to the bed and starved them to death or something. I mean, I guess they could have died some other way. I'm just telling you what went through my head at the time. I marked this area and the cabin on my map. I was surprised the cabin hadn't already been marked there. When I got out of the woods, I reported it to the police. But even though the body was probably there for a long time, and whoever tied them down was long gone, getting out of the mountains was such a creepy experience. I started hearing noises and got very jumpy. I kept thinking someone was following me. That likely wasn't true, though. It was just a completely freaky experience that had me on edge. At a really young age, my parents began letting me stay home alone. We were pretty poor at the time, so both had to work. I was given a key to the house, and whenever I would get home from school, I would get inside, lock the door, and wait for my parents to return home from work. I was never supposed to answer the door for anyone. I was 11 when this happened. I was walking home from school, and there was already a storm coming. The clouds were black and were slowly inching their way across the sky. I knew I'd have enough time to get home before it fully began pouring down though. I did arrive, although when I got home it was already completely dark outside due to the cloud cover. It was only about 3:30 p.m. too. When the rain finally began falling, the winds were extremely heavy. The thunder and lightning were even worse than I could recall from any other time. Unlike many people, I never really liked storms, so I was pretty scared. About 4:30, I heard a sudden knock at the door. I was always instructed not to open the door for anyone, nor to let anyone know I was home alone. I ignored it because of this, but this was also the first time anyone had come knocking when I was alone anyway. I really didn't have experience handling this situation. When the knocking continued for a few minutes, and whoever it was didn't seem like they were giving up, I didn't know what to do. After a while, the stranger used their fingernails and opened the mail slot of the door. "Hey kid, I know you're in there. Your parents have been in a car accident due to the storm, and they sent me to come pick you up and take you to the hospital, okay?" I got up and walked to the hallway. I knew I was supposed to ignore this person, but I had it figured that something serious must have happened to my parents. I was very concerned. I stood a few feet away from the door, and I could see the man was crouching down, peeking in through the mail slot. He clearly saw me as he called out to me. "Come on, kid, both your parents are hurt real bad. Come on out so I can get you to the hospital before anything bad happens to him." In an 11-year-old's mind, you don't really know what to do with that information. I didn't respond. I just stood there stunned and wondered what I should do. I was worried about my parents, of course, but they'd also told me to never let anyone know I was home alone, nor to let anyone I didn't know into the house. "Come on, kid!" the guy yelled this time, sounding angry and impatient. "If you don't come with me right now, your parents might die. You don't want your parents to die, do you?" Well, wrong move, buddy. One way to terrify me was to yell at me, so now I was terrified of the man. I ran away from the door, went up to my bedroom, and ran into the closet. I hid inside. I could still hear the man pounding on the door and screaming in through the mail slot. It lasted a while longer, but then I didn't hear anything else. I must have been hiding in the closet for nearly 2 hours, but it seemed like the man had gone away about an hour in. That was until I suddenly heard someone enter my bedroom. I nearly screamed when the doorknob turned and opened. There was my mom standing there, completely unharmed and wondering why I was hiding in the closet. I swiftly explained what happened, and that was the end of it. Although we don't know for sure it was him, a man was later arrested on several kidnappings in the area. My parents had never been hurt. This guy was just trying to get me to open the door and go with them. I was 11, and 11-year-olds can be quite gullible. Thank God we can be very scared of strangers too. Background: I'm 24 and female, and live with a roommate who's 23 and female, in an apartment in the suburbs of ATL. As you may well know, ATL is super dangerous and crime-riddled right now, so we have a Ring People camera, perfect for apartments, and a digital lock on our door for safety. Now on to the actual story. About 3 months ago, this really sweet family from across the hall moved out, and we got ourselves a new neighbor. His name is David, and let's just say he's quite interesting. When we first saw him moving in, we were a bit taken aback by the sheer amount of stuff he was trying to shove into his one-bedroom apartment. All of it was anime merch and Star Wars memorabilia. Definitely gave me some hoarder vibes. But that's none of my business. When the moving trucks left and a few days had passed by, My roommate and I knocked on his door to give him a friendly welcome to the neighborhood gift basket with some baked goods, dog treats, and poop bags for his dog. There were some scented seasonal candles as well. Apparently, that was not the correct thing to do though. After that day, David started to get creepy. It started out innocent enough. He would come to the door whenever he heard me or my roommate coming or going and have a quick casual chat. He would also come over regularly to ask for salt or sugar or toilet paper or whatever. Sometimes he would ask if we could come over and watch his dog for a bit. But within the past 2 weeks, things really began to escalate. 2 weeks ago, we were out pretty late partying at the bars near the Braves Stadium. We ended up getting home around 3 a.m., only to find David sitting at the top of the stairs waiting for us. He acted all upset, asked us where we'd been, and requested we tell him if we're planning to be out past midnight. I laughed in his face, and he called me a mindless Stacy. Still not sure what that means exactly. He asked for access to our Ring camera so we could make sure we were safe. We laughed at him again and went into our apartment. Here's the scary part though. When we checked the camera the next morning, we saw that he sat outside our apartment the entire time in front of our door for the rest of the night. When we saw that, we contacted the complex to let them know he was acting crazy. And they told us to contact the police, so we did just that. The police told us to contact them if he made any threats, but since we lived in a shared space, they couldn't do anything until he entered our apartment or threatened us in some way. I assume the complex said something to him at least, because he left us alone for the next 5 days or so. The next week, he really got out of control though, constantly lurking outside our apartment. My roommate had to start leaving for work an hour earlier just to not cross paths with him. I can't leave the apartment during the day because he's constantly just standing outside waiting for me. He leaves love letters on our door, on our cars, in our mailbox. Once, when I told him I wasn't interested, he told me he would kill me and then himself if I didn't go on a date with him. Of course, I didn't get that down in writing, so the police decided not to do shit. He put up a Ring doorbell of his own too, so we could track all of our movements. He'll leave these really creepy sexual notes when we're gone, and we'll find them in the most random places when we come back too. We just don't know what to do. A few years back, I was making the ride home from college for the Thanksgiving break. I was a freshman at the time, and Thanksgiving break was the first bit of freedom I'd had from a really hectic schedule. I decided that even though it was a long drive home, I would enjoy the free time to think. I have to admit that back then I was still rather idealistic. I tried to see the good in everyone, and it caused me to make quite a few mistakes. A very good portion of the ride was driving through cornfields in the middle of nowhere. I'd hit a small town, then drive for miles through cornfields, then hit another small town. It didn't take long for this to begin getting quite old. I began getting very bored in the late evening when I saw a guy walking along the side of the road all alone. Maybe because I felt like it was a chance to do a good deed, or more likely because I was so bored. I pulled my car over and offered the guy a ride. If you've ever picked up a hitchhiker, occasionally you pick someone up and you immediately regret it. I sort of had that feeling in this case. The guy was only a few years older than me. He was lanky and had long black hair and a big scraggly black beard. He was wearing dirty blue jeans and a Metallica t-shirt. None of that was what bothered me though. If that sort of thing bugged me at all, then my college campus would have been a complete nightmare. It was filled with people like that. No, what got me about this guy was the way he talked. If I remember correctly, his name was Travis. After introducing himself, he then asked me if I'd ever picked up a hitchhiker before. I told him I'd done it once or twice when I was a teenager and still living at home, but it was only ever other high school students. After I told him that, Travis began talking all about hitchhikers, and it wasn't positive stuff either. He began rambling about how dangerous it was to pick up random hitchhikers, And hadn't I heard about all the serial killers who posed as hitchhikers along the side of the road at night? He then started listing off several killers who'd been involved in hitchhiking. This absolutely sent a cold chill down my spine. He not only listed them out, he began talking about how they committed their crimes and how they could have done it better. I was nervous and about to ask him to stop the car and get out. However, before I could even open my mouth, he reached into the pocket of his jeans jacket and pulled out a pocket knife. I felt a jolt inside me, but hoped he didn't notice. Travis flipped out one of the blades of the knife and immediately began cleaning his fingernails with it. I did my best to pretend like I wasn't even noticing. I asked him again where he wanted me to take him. He lived in a house just outside the next town, he said. I asked him what he was doing so far away from home. He said he was visiting some friends, and they hadn't offered him a ride home. I just kept trying to think of a way to get rid of this guy. My fuel gauge gave me that opportunity at least. I was going to stop the car at a gas station and try to get away from him. I noticed the gauge was pretty low. We were in a town at this point, and I knew I could find a gas station nearby. My plan was to leave him in the car, then go into the station and call the cops. I let Travis know I needed to grab some fuel and asked him if he knew where a station in town was. It didn't take me long to find it on my own though. I pulled in and filled up my car while Travis sat inside fiddling with his knife. I let him know I was going inside to pay. It was at that point he surprised me. He jumped out of the car holding his knife to me. "I'll go in with you," he insisted. "I think I could use a drink." My plan was ruined. I wasn't sure how in the hell I would be able to get the attendant to call the police if Travis was in there with me. I thought quickly as we were walking, and I pretended I'd left my wallet in the car. I told him to head on in and grab himself whatever he wanted. I let him know I would pay for everything. Travis nodded and eyed me, then headed into the station. I went back to my car, only to notice him watching me from the door of the station. It took all of my nerves, but I started the car up right away. I saw him immediately come out of the gas station, running at me with his knife at the ready. I put the car in drive and took off quickly. Travis was screaming at me to come back, but that wasn't going to happen. I had to drive straight to the police department for a couple of reasons. I didn't really have anything on Travis they could arrest him for, but when I had driven away from the gas station without paying, which is a crime, I knew I had to do something about that. I had to go back and let them know what happened later, and pay for the gas as well. The police accompanied me back, and I paid the clerk soon after. Thank God by that time Travis was long gone. I've told quite a few people this story, and almost no one believes me. It's most definitely true though, and is the freakiest thing that has ever happened to me. I had a few years where I was sort of down on my luck. I live in an area with a lot of my relatives. One of my aunts was having a party, and I ended up staying a lot later than I should have. There was free beer though, so I kind of had to. I got a bit intoxicated, and when my cousin, who was supposed to be driving me home, wanted to leave, I declined because I wanted to stay and keep drinking. He left on his own, and I was left without a ride home. When I finally felt it was time to leave, I had an extremely long and uncomfortable walk ahead of me. While you might think that my aunt or someone else could have given me a lift home, my family was a bit tired of having to drive me places. I prepared for this really long walk down this country road. Although I had been drinking, the atmosphere outside sobered me up pretty quickly. It was really dark and very brisk. For some strange reason, it was also eerily quiet this night. I mean, usually there are all sorts of animal noises, crickets, frogs, other things that bump in the night. But this time, everything was calm and completely silent. I did become aware of some noises further out into the woods though, as if an animal were walking around back there. The noises didn't go away either, which made me start to think that this animal might be following me. Of course, I was very nervous at this point. I didn't exactly fancy being someone's midnight snack. I tried to hurry it along a little bit. I did get slightly ahead of the noises, so I figured it would be okay from then on. Right then, though, I heard the sound of several twigs breaking. This sound stopped immediately after that. I had this feeling that whatever had been following me was now directly behind me and no longer moving. I told myself to keep moving forward. Part of me, though, said I just had to turn around and see what was going on. Very slowly, I forced myself to turn around. When I saw my pursuer, I screamed. There was a large figure in the dark, standing behind me. They had to be nearly 7 feet tall, and it almost seemed like their eyes were glowing red in the darkness. They stood there, staring down at me. I took off running right away, obviously. I was so terrified that I didn't even notice if they were following me. I didn't know how far I actually ran either, or if it followed me at all. After an eternity, though, I looked back and finally saw nothing was there. It was still eerily quiet, and I was still terrified, but I walked the rest of the way home. Now, I know everyone will just tell me that I was drunk, and I imagined this or something, but never before has drinking beer caused me to hallucinate someone in the dark. I know what I saw that night, and I never went for a walk in the middle of nowhere again because of it. My friend Josh and I were hanging out one day. I think we were about 13 years old at the time. I remember this happening in late fall, because there were still a lot of leaves falling down from the trees. We had hopped a fence and followed some train tracks which went through a local forest. We liked walking on the rails and pretending we were tightrope walkers. Yeah, I know that sounds pretty lame, but we enjoyed it, even though we weren't supposed to play on the train tracks. We were absolutely safe though. I mean, there's no way we wouldn't know exactly when a train was coming. It would surely be loud, and we'd see it from far away as well. The forested area was not so thickened with trees that you couldn't see far down the tracks. We'd been hanging out, balancing and talking for a while, when we saw someone who was also walking on the tracks. He was a bit off in the distance and seemed to be walking towards us. I couldn't exactly tell how old he was, but we figured he was probably a teenager, probably a few years older than both me and Josh were. He was wearing jeans and a hoodie, and he had his hood up over his head. His hands were hidden in the front pocket of his hoodie, and he was looking down as he walked right in the middle of the train tracks. Now this really wasn't unusual on its own. We'd seen other people walking by the tracks while we were out before. It was probably just someone who wanted to be alone, or maybe someone who was out for a walk, and the train tracks were the best way to find their way back. Anyhow, the guy was still a bit away from us now. It was then, though, that we heard it. There was a train coming, and we heard it approaching from behind us. Josh and I looked back, seeing the train was at a very safe distance away behind us still. And the two of us jumped off the rail, and we walked a couple of yards away from the tracks. You know, so the sound wouldn't deafen us. We looked over at the guy who was still walking towards us, but he didn't get off the track, or react at all even. I recall feeling very uneasy in that moment. Josh thought it was just a guy that was going to play a game of chicken with the train. That was an activity I'd always thought was dumb as what? I screamed at the man that a train was coming, which in a way seemed somewhat pointless. There was no way he didn't hear the train, but he still didn't move at all. He just kept walking forward in the middle of the track, right in the direction of the train. As the train quickly passed us by, I began to run forward a bit. I was really scared that this guy wasn't moving at all. I screamed at him more, but there was no way he could even hear me over the sound of the train approaching now. The rest happened so fast that my brain had trouble processing it. It was like time slowed down as the guy looked up and directly into my eyes. I kept expecting him to jump out of the way of the train at the last minute, like it was some sort of action movie, but instead, the train hit him dead on, right in front of my eyes. He didn't even try to move. I immediately collapsed on the ground and started vomiting. Josh did too. I won't describe what we saw in full detail. It's too awful to even remember. The train stopped, of course. The policemen and the fire department rushed in as well. We waited there in case they needed to talk to us. Came to find out later that the guy was a student at a nearby high school. He left a suicide note to his parents and let the train hit him dead on. Words can never describe how awful that experience was. I had nightmares about it for years afterward. Often, in those very same nightmares, I would once again see him looking into my eyes. I would always feel his blood splashing over me, covering me completely, and then I would wake up screaming. This incident happened not all that long ago, actually. I'm a 19-year-old female, and I obviously enjoy a night out with my friends. This particular night, a girlfriend and I had headed down to our local club/pub. We were dancing, drinking, and having a great time when I noticed it was around 2 a.m. or so. It was coming up on the closing time of 3 a.m. I noted we should probably think about heading out soon. If we waited until it actually closed, the wait for a taxi would be quite long, as everyone else would be looking for one as well. I let my friend in on my plans, and she insisted she wanted to stay. She then walked me out the front while I waited for a taxi. As we got to the top of the stairs, she saw me off at the door and headed back inside. I said goodbye to the bouncers, as I said it was a local place, and started walking over to the next taxi in the line. As I approached the taxi, I heard my friend call to me from behind. She still had my bank cards and money on her. Luckily, I walked back to the door to get them off of her, then said goodbye again. This time, as I turned to leave though, the bouncer stopped me. "Hey, you may want to take this second taxi in the line." Upon me questioning him, he didn't seem to have a reason behind this sudden advice and just insisted I trust him. I'm from Australia, and taxis usually wait in these lines. You have to take the next taxi as part of fairness. I explained to the bouncer that not only will taxi driver number 1 not be happy, but taxi number 2 may not even take my fare for this reason. Annoying, I know. Me being 19 and naive, I thought to myself, I only live around the corner. I have my phone as well. What's the worst that could happen, right? Well, obviously that was wrong. I took the first taxi in the line as I initially meant to. There were no immediate alarm bells. The man didn't seem any different than any other taxi driver. Not exactly polite, nor rude either. Just a normal guy. We were a few minutes into the fare, driving along the coastlines to my suburb, when all of a sudden, he pulled the taxi over to the side of the road and started walking around to my door. At this point, I was extremely confused as to what was going on. First, I thought maybe there was a flat tire or something, until he opened my door. I asked him what he was doing, and he replied to me, "We're going to the beach now." Alarm bells and red flags went off left, right, and center. I grabbed my phone and dialed 000 right away. I told him I was calling the police. I immediately saw him start to panic. He yelled at me not to be so silly and said he just wanted to spend some quality time with me. He reached for my arm and grabbed me to try to pull me out of the car. I pushed him away though, grabbed the door and slammed it closed. I waited to be connected. I've read quite a lot about people who are polite to creepers in these situations, but I was anything but at this point. I was soon connected with someone from emergency who asked me what my emergency was. I said I needed assistance right now and gave her the area where we were. She then proceeded to tell me I needed to call the police assistance line if it wasn't a true emergency. "Well, it's about to be if you don't get someone down here right now." She assured me a car was on the way and to get out of the car by myself. We were only a minute or two down the road from where we'd departed. Usually, there were at least 3 or 4 squad cars situated there, preparing for the end-of-night antics. Because of this, I knew I could have assistance in no time. While this was happening, the man was walking back to his driver's side, attempting to get back in. I don't know what he would have done if he'd gotten in with me in the car still, kicked me out or what, but I jumped out of the car as he got in, and he sped off without looking back. I kicked myself for not getting his taxi ID, which is something I'd usually do. I kicked myself even more for not just listening to the bouncer, who I see now obviously had a good reason for me to not get in this car. I rang my friend and asked her to stay on the phone with me. I told her I was still outside waiting for the taxi and had gotten bored. She offered to come and wait, but I insisted I was fine. Once the police came, they took me home and asked me what happened. They took a statement from me as well, but there wasn't much they could do, as I hadn't gotten any information on the taxi. The most I could provide was the driver's appearance and the company he worked for. I didn't tell anyone about the situation except for my then friend, who's now my boyfriend. He was shaken up by this. I hate thinking about what might have happened that night, and how lucky I am that it didn't. About 2 months on, my boyfriend, his housemate, and my sister arranged a cab to pick us up at my boyfriend's place and take us to the same venue this initially happened at. Guess which driver showed up? Yeah, that very same guy. I didn't say anything at the time to anyone because I knew it wouldn't have turned out well in the moment, but this time I made sure to get his ID and plate number and reported it to the police the very next day. Apparently, this wasn't even the first time he'd done something like this. It was the furthest he'd ever gotten, though. Most of the other complaints were similar. From what I know, the police made contact with the taxi company and informed them of the situation. I think he might have been let go after, but I'm not sure. I've definitely learned a lesson from this, though. When I was 19 years old, I moved out of my parents' house and rented a little studio apartment by myself. At the time, I was going to school full-time and working at least 30 hours a week as well. I had a job in a small sub-sandwich shop. Because school was so expensive and I really needed the money, I agreed to work on Thanksgiving night. My family was a bit upset that I wouldn't be coming over, but they understood that I really needed this. I knew going into that workday that I would be by myself after 5 p.m. We didn't exactly expect the place to be packed and busy on the Thanksgiving holiday. I had worked there since I was 16, so I was trusted to close the store all by myself. Around the time that my last coworker left, the snow also began to start falling. So now, in addition to being slow due to being Thanksgiving, the snowfall was killing off any business we might have had. I decided to try and make the best of it though. I went and grabbed my astronomy textbook out of my bag and tried to spend some time reading and studying. I wasn't aware of how much time had passed before I finally noticed someone outside the shop. By this time, the snow was falling so hard that there was no visibility at all beyond a foot or two in front of you. I could still see the silhouette of a man. He came into the foyer and began shaking the snow off his body. I put my book to one side and went over to the counter. I put my gloves on and the guy walked in further. I felt uncomfortable right away. Not just because I was alone though. It wasn't the first time I had ever been in the store by myself with a customer. There was just something about this guy though. He just had a weird air about him that made me feel very uneasy. He kept on glancing around the place like he was extremely nervous for some reason. He was also a pretty big guy. He was wearing a jean jacket in the middle of a snowstorm, which was quite odd as well. He walked up to the counter and began looking around. When I asked him if I could help him, he looked amused. "I guess you must be one of the lower employees," he commented. Confused, I asked him what I meant. "Well, I figure it's the lower employees they force to work on Thanksgiving," he said. "New people, maybe no family to go home to." I forced a weak smile. "I do indeed have a family to go home to," I assured him. "I'm just working late because I need the money." "That's too bad," the man responded. When I asked why he said that, he then responded with this: "Because your family's Thanksgiving is gonna be ruined when they find your body in the dumpster out back." If you've never had someone threaten your life out of the blue, I can't even tell you what it felt like. It was what I would imagine being hit by a lightning bolt would feel like. He said that with a smile on his face, but the look in his eye indicated he was not joking at all. I looked over at the phone on the wall by the register. When I did, he shifted to the side, indicating he would get to me before I even dialed a single number. Though I was scared to death, I suddenly made the smartest decision I ever made. I was still behind the sandwich counter, so I grabbed the knife and threw it at the guy. This clearly surprised him, and while he was falling backward off balance, I turned and ran back to the manager's office. I slammed and locked the door. He hopped over the counter in a matter of seconds and tried to force the door open. It was impossible though. The store safe was kept in that room, so there were no windows and the door was quite heavy. I grabbed the phone on the desk and called the police right away. By the time they got there though, the guy was obviously long gone. I'll never forget the look on his face and the sound in his voice when he mentioned my family finding my dead body in a dumpster. I had this really weird experience that haunts me to this day. I had a great uncle who was around 80 years old. At the time, his wife had passed away a few months earlier. They had been together since they were in high school, so he was of course very devastated by the sudden loss. It's hard to say that my uncle withdrew from the world because he was already sort of withdrawn. He lived out in the hills in this beautiful old house he had built by himself. He was very handy and very rarely came down off the hill for any reason, at least after my aunt passed away. He spent about 5 months without even driving down into town or contacting anyone. My family was very concerned about him. My mother told me that when she went to see him, he specifically asked if I could come and stay with him for a while. I always enjoyed spending time with my uncle, so I readily agreed to the drive. His house was a long ways away. When I say he lived way out in the hills, he was really way far out there. I got to his house eventually though, and went in to see him. I was shocked to see just how much the man had aged. Not only that, but he also acted much differently now. He was extremely paranoid and refused to be left alone in the house. Literally, when he was ready to go to sleep, he would beg me to stay in the room with him. He was afraid to be alone. This was a big surprise to me because I had never known this man to be scared in his entire life. My uncle told me that ever since his wife had passed away though, he'd been seeing a man dressed in black. The man would usually wait outside the house. He would always step out from behind a tree for a moment. Then, as soon as my uncle spotted him, he would move away again. He even told me that once or twice, he'd caught the man watching him through one of his windows, but whenever the man was caught watching, he would step away. Obviously, I thought my uncle was just losing it. He was understandably distraught about losing his wife, and clearly the stress was making him see things. However, whether the problem was real or not, I was more than willing to stay with him to make him feel better. About 2 weeks after I'd arrived, my uncle was in bed. I'd come into the room with him and waited on the chair while he slept. I decided I really needed to get up and stretch my legs a bit in that moment. My uncle was a really deep sleeper anyway, so the chances of him waking up at all and noticing I was gone were pretty damn slim. I got up and went to the kitchen. I decided to work quickly on making myself something to eat. While I was just finishing cooking something though, I suddenly heard this horrendous noise coming from my uncle's room. At first, it sounded like a scream, accompanied by a loud shattering sound. Completely freaked out, I dropped my food and sprinted to my uncle's bedroom as fast as I could. I'll never get the image of what I saw that night out of my head. My uncle was still laying down in bed, as white as a sheet. His eyes were open wide, and for a moment I almost thought he was dead. That's how still he was being. Even stranger still, though, was what he was staring at. He was staring at the window facing his bed. As I observed closer, I saw it had been completely shattered. There was glass all over the floor, and it was very evident that whatever destroyed this window had done so from the outside. I checked around the outside and inside of the house. I not only found nothing, I found no trace of anything being there at all. My uncle was terrified to be alone while I was checking the premises, but there was nothing I could do about it. I had to make sure no one was there still. After a thorough check, I still found nothing. I hated to do this to him, but I had to take my uncle off that hill. He was so scared, but whatever had happened to him made it even worse. I took him to the hospital to check up, but unfortunately his mental state had deteriorated from the attack so badly that he wouldn't be allowed to go back to the house. My mom arranged for him to be put into a home, and I repaired the damage to the window. Nothing was stolen when I got back. I stayed there for a while, but I never saw the man my uncle talked about. And no further vandalism ever happened there again. I have no idea what that was about, but it seemed to be targeting my uncle for some reason. I work at a bar in a suburb of Melbourne that is safe during the day but has become sort of notorious for a high rate of abductions during the nighttime, specifically along the main street that my work is on. I often work night shifts or late shifts even. Tonight, I even finished at 11 p.m. for some context. I'm an uppity 19-year-old girl. I got out of work at 11 p.m. and started to walk down the street. It's quite well lit in some parts, but extremely dark in others. I began looking to hail a taxi. I was having no luck in finding one though. In fact, there were very few cars about at this time, which was quite unusual actually. I looked across the road, only to see a man with a hoodie on that was concealing almost all of his face. From the parts that I could see, he looked somewhat young, maybe early to mid-20s, and seemed to be high on something. Quite a shady figure to me. I noted he was pretty tall as well. I guess I'd been looking at him for too long though, because he immediately crossed the street towards me, and I stopped looking at him. I started to walk faster, looking behind me to keep an eye on his distance, and now even more desperate to hop in a taxi. When I turned around to look at him once again, to my relief, he was walking down a side street. I stepped out onto the street to get a better view down the road when he came back around from that side street he'd just entered. My stomach dropped as I saw he now had 2 more people accompanying him. I started to walk really fast now, and they began to walk after me. I was going as fast as I could without jogging and was getting really panicked, thinking of hailing down just any car to ask someone for help. The 3 men were quickly gaining on me and were all screaming and shouting at me. My anxiety had started to sink in though, and I couldn't hear a word that they said. It was all only white noise basically. A taxi with its lights off drove past, and I ran out into the middle of the road. The driver stopped and said he was finished for the day and wasn't taking any more customers. I told him I was being followed and asked if I could sit in his car for a second just to feel safe. He let me into his taxi, drove 20 meters away, and told me to get out. The men were still there though. I begged him to take me out of sight at least a little further down the road. When he noticed how genuinely scared I was at that moment, I guess he got concerned and adopted a more fatherly tone. The taxi driver was actually extremely kind afterward and refused to let me get out of his car until he found me another taxi to get me home safely. He drove around with me for a few minutes until we found another empty one. He beeped the other cab down and explained the situation to him. I thanked both drivers profusely, and we swapped cars without incident. The next driver was also incredibly nice as well. He said he had a young daughter at home and got quite upset and angry, thinking about how people can take away your right to feel safe. I'm extremely thankful they were there to help me out that night. I don't know what would have happened if they weren't. My husband and I were stopping over in New York before heading to our temporary home of Poland. We had been living there for about a year or so and are originally from Australia. We'd spent the past year traveling throughout some of the more shady parts of Europe, so we thought we were generally prepared for any weird incidents that might occur. We were tired as we walked through JFK, ignoring everyone who wanted us to take their special taxi or whatever. We went outside and waited in the line with all the other irritated travelers. When it was our turn, the taxi driver got out and left. Another guy came and took our bags. The motor was still running even. I didn't really think anything of it, and didn't really care at that point. When I insisted I take my own bag and tried to open the trunk though, the man suddenly snapped at me. I was startled and said it was okay. I'd just sit with it on my lap instead. My husband and I traveled light, so we only had one suitcase between us. "Can you open the trunk?" my husband asked the guy. "Otherwise, there's going to be no room for us." The guy already looked pissed, and all we were asking was for him to do his job. I was already looking around for another cab because I couldn't be bothered. "Fine," the guy snapped. He basically ripped the trunk open. I hadn't even gotten into the car yet. It was kind of a paranoid thing that I never got into the taxi alone, as a result of some kidnapping stories and griefs of a similar nature. I waited, and then I saw what was in the trunk as the man quickly tried to close it once more. It wasn't all over the flooring or anything, just on one side, but it instantly made me feel ill. I could see what looked a lot like blood. The spot was visibly wet, and I stared at it blankly. Even with the dim light, I could just about make out various other stains of similar darker colors. I had barely begun to process what I'd seen before he slipped my suitcase in and the trunk door was slammed. I was now wide awake and did not want to get in this taxi. Everything was wrong, and this was clearly a mistake. "Come on, what's the holdup? Get in!" the taxi stand dude urged us, as equally pissed off passengers behind us were waiting for their own rides. I tried to get my husband's attention, but he was already in the back seat. If this were a horror movie and I was watching, I would be screaming at the screen, "Don't get in that cab!" I got in the taxi anyway, with my bag on my lap. I clutched it as we spun around the corners, went forward sharply, and had brakes slamming constantly. I felt sick and couldn't stop thinking about what I'd just seen. Was that real? Halfway through my haze, though, I realized we were not going the right way. I mean, far be it for me to tell taxi drivers in their own city where the hell they're going. I like to be prepared, though, and I like to know where I am. If we're not taking the tourist scenic route where they charge you a lot of dough, this guy was clearly going the wrong way. "Hey, where are you going?" The words just fell out of my mouth. The man didn't say anything, though. He didn't flinch, didn't move, didn't even respond. "What?" My husband asked me if we were really going the wrong way. I shouted that we were. My husband, not one to take this shit from anyone, then turned to the man. "Hey man, don't think you can screw with us. We're not paying more than we agreed upon, so stop fucking around and take us where we're going, or I'm gonna call the cops." He had no idea why I was freaking out, though. I didn't care about the extra money. I thought we were just a pawn in whatever this guy's master plan was. We were going to be swimming with the fishes in the Hudson or something. I was going crazy. My mind was wandering. Maybe that actually was blood in the trunk. This guy was going to kill us with his driving either way. Maybe some plans for later in some warehouse with all his serial killer friends or something. The driver immediately slammed on the brakes at a set of lights. "I'm pretty sure this is not a real taxi," I muttered to myself. The cab driver immediately spoke up. "Do you see the sign up there? It's a nickel taxi, you moron," he snapped. "Well then do your job," my husband snapped back at him without a second thought. Perhaps the guy thought this was too much trouble when loudmouth Ozzy Bogan and his crazy wife started snapping at him, because the driver suddenly turned around and we were going the right way to get to the hotel now. I made sure to check the trunk again when we got out, but it was much darker now, and I couldn't see anything clearly, except for a lot of shredded rags for some reason, with a deep rust color staining them all. This happened when I was 15, near Algonquin Park. My father and I were driving up to our cottage in the middle of winter. I always was so amazed at the beauty of the area and Muskoka, and had grown up enjoying the beauty of it every summer. Our cottage was on a large lake, about a 30-minute drive from the nearest town. There were probably thousands of cottages out on that lake. During summer, the lake and the town's population tripled. It was cottage country, so people would spend all summer enjoying the lake and warm nights around campfires with their family and friends. I spent pretty much every summer there growing up, and it still brings fond memories of sunshine and laughter and the sounds of motorboats out on the lake. But the winters were very different. And the people that didn't live there all year round would venture back home to the city life, leaving the area almost completely deserted, with the cottages all boarded up for the winter. There were a few people who would still frequently come up every couple of months for a few days or so, but for the most part the lake was completely silent during the winters, and the town was only filled with locals. The beautiful pine trees were always covered in snow, making an eerie ambiance. Our cottage was situated on a dead-end road. There were about 20 other cottages on that road, with ours being somewhat right in the middle. The cottages were quite spaced out, however, with our closest neighbors being too far away to even see through the trees. My dad had needed to head up there to do some painting that my mom had been bugging him to do. It was at the end of February, and it was a long weekend. I tagged along so he wouldn't be alone, and we could spend some quality time together. It was about a 5-hour drive, but it turned out to be an 8-hour drive this time due to the heavy snow. It had gotten dark out quite early, and it was around midnight as we drove through the park. It was deadly quiet and pitch black except for the headlights of our car. We finally passed through with only about 30 minutes left to arrive to our destination. It had finally stopped snowing, and we were both just eager to get there. As we turned down a familiar road, I remember my dad cursing a storm. It hadn't been plowed yet. This wasn't surprising, however. It probably wouldn't even be until later the next day that we would even see a snowplow. As we drove down the snowy road, we noticed there seemed to be a fresh set of tire tracks. "The Smiths must be up for the weekend," my dad said. All of a sudden, though, as we drove around the bend following the tire tracks, the headlights of the car shone on a white van that was parked on the side of the road. It was almost completely hidden by the vast trees that were covered in snow, hiding in the darkness. "What the?" my dad mumbled. As we drove past this van, I remember looking back through the back window and very clearly seeing two figures in the front seat, illuminated by our retreating taillights. As I told my dad this, he simply shrugged. "I don't know, maybe they're lost or something." I nodded, but I couldn't help but think about how this was a dead-end road, so why would they feel the need to park there of all places? As we pulled into our driveway and started bringing in all our stuff, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was not right here. I couldn't stop thinking about that van. Why was it there with two people just sitting in the dark in the middle of a snowing night? It spooked me so much that I begged my dad to let me sleep upstairs with him. I didn't want to sleep alone downstairs in the room my sister and I usually shared. It had big windows with no blinds that looked out into the blackness of the forest. My 15-year-old self was already scared enough of the dark. I didn't need to see the white van creeping around. It wasn't a big deal when my sister was there, but not alone, and not tonight. As my dad got ready for bed, I sat in the living room reading a book. My dad had turned all the lights off already, so I was using a small lamp next to the couch to try and get through one last chapter before bed. It was so quiet I could almost hear my own ears ringing. Suddenly, I started to get the feeling that I was now being watched. The living room also had large windows with no curtains that overlooked the lake. It was completely black outside, except for a single light from some cottages across the lake. I shut off the lamp and got up. Now, the cottage was completely dark. The moon was shining brightly, illuminating the snow. It was quite a beautiful sight, actually. I walked toward the window a bit to get a better look. As I did so, movement caught the corner of my eye. I remember my heart dropping as I saw two figures down by the back porch, crouched below the window, barely hidden by the surrounding trees. I dropped to the floor and crawled toward the bedroom where my dad was sleeping, my heart in my throat. I couldn't be sure if they had seen me or not. I hurriedly woke my dad up, and by the time he got to the window, the two figures were long gone. Where I had seen the figures, though, were two sets of footprints in the snow, which led back around to the front of the cottage and back down the driveway. I begged my dad not to go outside. He double-checked the locks and turned on the porch lights, hopefully to scare the intruders off. My dad wasn't as freaked out as I was, but he still set the alarm before he headed back to bed. I was extremely freaked out, though. I lay there all night next to my dad, terrified I'd look out the window and see someone staring back at me. The next morning, we went outside and confirmed there were two sets of footprints leading from the road to behind our cottage, then back around to the front and back up the road. There were also tire marks that showed a vehicle had turned around and then gone back up to the main road. My dad guessed they were probably looking to break in and steal stuff, as it was in the middle of winter and not too many people were at the lake. Thing is though, these guys knew we were there. They would have seen our tire tracks leading up to the cottage and my dad's car parked up front. They would also have seen the lamp I'd turned on to read, or at least seen it go off. My dad didn't have an answer to that, and after much back and forth, he called the non-emergency line and reported it. Apparently, there had been some break-ins in the area, and some stuff had been stolen from some cottages that were boarded up for the winter. I still wonder to this day, though, why would they be interested in stealing from the only house that clearly had people still inside it? I had to attend a family reunion a few years ago. Unfortunately, I really didn't have the money to fly, nor the money to stay in a hotel on the way there. Because of this, my plan was to drive the entire way and sleep at rest areas in my car. It made sense to me. It would ensure that I would be able to visit my relatives on this 3-day trip. I would be sleeping in the car for at least 2 nights. I brought along some pillows and blankets so I could curl up in the back seat. The first night came and went without incident. I found a rest area and was able to just hang out in the parking lot. The second day of driving, however, had me going through the mountains. I had never made this trip before, so I wasn't sure if I would even find a rest area on the way. I drove for a very long time, and when my eyes were beginning to close by themselves, I figured I would have to pull out on the side of the road to get a little rest. It was obviously much harder to go to sleep this time, but at least it was quiet and dark. Very few cars actually came across that road. I'm not sure how long I'd been asleep before I felt something wake me up. I thought I felt my car moving a bit. Then I assumed it was probably just something I'd felt when I was sleeping. I closed my eyes, and then I felt it again. My car bobbed up and down a bit. I was afraid, peeking out from under the blankets. I caught sight of someone standing at the front of my car. He had his foot resting on the bumper, and he was pushing it down with his foot, causing my car to bob a bit. I was about to hide back under the blankets when I looked to the side window. I saw a second person there, peeking inside. I jumped up, and when I did, I saw the first guy leave the front of the car and come around to the side window where I was. He began slamming on my door and trying to open it. Fortunately, it was already locked. They started banging on my windows. I was completely freaked out at this point. I decided the best thing to do would be getting to the front seat and to drive off. Right before I started the car, though, the first guy succeeded in breaking in my window. I yelled and quickly pulled away. I have no clue why those guys were antagonizing me, but I did not stop driving until I got to the reunion. And obviously, I never slept outside at night again. Now this happened a very long time ago. It was in 1976. To indicate how disturbing it was for me, it's taken me this long to really talk about it. My best friend in high school was a guy named Bryant. When we graduated, we ended up going to different colleges, so we didn't get to see each other that much. Communication in the 70s wasn't quite as easy as it is nowadays. There was no email, and expensive long-distance communication meant we could only really communicate with postcards or letters. We had an agreement, though, that in the beginning of every single summer vacation, the two of us would go camping together for a week. I won't mention where we went camping, just know that it was in a large forested area. We had a map, of course, and we tried to see how far we could go in our half a week before turning and making it back. We slept in different tents. The morning after the third night of hiking, Bryant told me he hadn't slept all that great. He said he kept hearing a rustling sound in the leaves outside his tent. He actually thought there was a human being out there, walking around our camping area. I didn't really believe him, though. I told him it was probably just an animal. I couldn't think of any reason why a person would be circling our camp in the middle of the night, out this far into the wilderness. The following morning, Bryant once again looked like he hadn't slept very much at all. When I asked him, he told me he'd again heard the same rustling around our camp as he had the night before. He insisted again it really was a person. I wasn't really sure what I could tell him. I mean, if it was a person, there wasn't a whole lot we could do about it. We were already beginning to head back anyway, so I couldn't just say, hey, let's turn around right now and leave. We were already in the middle of doing that. The next night, usually I would fall asleep pretty quickly. However, I decided I would try and stay up to see if I could hear what Bryant had been hearing. I tried to stay up, but I kept feeling my eyes trying to close up on their own. I kept catching myself and jerking my head up to stay awake. I think it was when I was just beginning to drift off that something fully pulled me out of my sleep. There was some noise, some rustling coming from around the camp. That immediately woke me up. I listened in closely. Bryant really had been right. It sounded like someone was circling our camp. I mean, I had no way of knowing if it was a person instead of an animal, as Bryant had claimed. But I guess I didn't know why an animal would be circling us all night for days, rather than actually doing something. Needless to say, I did not sleep very well that night either. Eventually, I pulled it off, though. When I got up, I noticed that Bryant hadn't gotten up yet. I decided to let him sleep for a while longer. He likely needed any sleep he could get. However, when an hour passed by and he still hadn't gotten up, I decided to wake him up myself. I called out his name, but there was no answer. I knocked on his tent, which is quite the funny thing to say, I admit. Still no answer. I called out louder, but there was no response. I never would have opened his tent without his permission, but now I was quite worried. I opened the tent to wake him up, but I saw he wasn't there. I was still a bit worried, but now I figured he'd probably just woken up early and went out on his own. Another hour passed by, though, and he still didn't come back. I kept calling out for him, but he never responded. I combed the area, and I couldn't find him at all. I can't begin to describe you how difficult this situation was. I waffled over just looking for him by myself or booking it to a ranger station. When I'd spent a significant amount of time trying to find him and failing, I finally went to a ranger station. A search was organized. The search had no better luck than I had, though. They didn't find a single trace of him. That was 41 years ago, and I haven't seen nor heard hide or hair of him since that day. They never found a body, living or dead, but I never saw my best friend again. I have no idea what really happened to him, but my view was pretty much that whatever happened to my buddy, it had something to do with whoever was circling our tents in the night. What is up, guys? Blue Spooky here. Thank you guys so much for watching, especially if you made it this far to the end of the video. If you liked the video, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. If you have any feedback for me as well, be sure to leave that in comments below the video. If you guys have a story you'd like to send in, or if you'd like to contact me for any reasons, there will be links to my social media in the description below the video, including my Facebook, Gmail, and Twitter accounts. go ahead and send me a message on any of those, and I'll try to get to you as soon as possible. If you do decide to send in a story, please be sure to include in the tagline what the name of the story is if it has one, what type of story it is if it has one, and how you'd like to be credited in the description below the video. Please make sure to include as much detail as you feel comfortable with and try to use as much proper grammar as possible to make sure you have the highest chance of appearing in a future video. Overall, I think that's pretty much it for now, guys, so thank you so much for watching, and I hope you guys have a great day.